I'm delighted to host Neysun Mahboubi all the way from the United States. We are very lucky to have Neysun. Actually, Neysun usually in this period of the academic year is in China, because Neysun is a research scholar of the Center for the Study of Contemporary China at the University of Pennsylvania. And his research activities include a constant dose of field work in China. But unfortunately for China, unfortunately for us, the lockdown measures have disrupted his earlier plans. And so it's a real privilege to have Neysun, who is also a lecturer in law at Penn Law School. And he hosts a podcast, the GSCC podcast, and is also a leading member of the UPenn project on the future of U.S. China relations, which is really what we're going to talk about today. His primary academic interests are in the areas of administrative law and comparative law, but Neysun has been a China watcher for quite a while, and he can speak authoritatively of Chinese politics at large, and also of what is going to be a defining factor in 21st century world politics, which is U.S.-China relations. And we want to know all about your impressions from the U.S. and also what do you think will be the implications for third actors, so including European actors. And we look forward to also engage you in a conversation at the end of your presentation. Thanks so much for being here. And please do welcome him with a round of applause.
Thank you very much, Julio, for the very kind introduction and this wonderful opportunity to come to the EUI to meet with all of you, to share some thoughts about the current crisis in U.S.-China relations and what its possible implications for Europe may be. What I'd like to do is have a dialogue, and so I will try not to speak for too long, but I do want to do a couple of things in Great. So I want to do a couple of things in setting up the terms for our discussion. I want to tell you a little bit about this current moment in U.S.-China relations and what brought us here, what looks like maybe on the horizon with the new administration and possible new directions, and then talk about where Europe fits into this picture, in terms of its relations with China, in terms of its relations with the United States. And then finally, I have some reflections on some thoughts for what may be useful for European actors to contemplate as they continue to think about how to navigate between the US and China, which are in this moment of ongoing crisis. The first thing I think that's important to set out when talking about U.S.-China relations is that for many years after the normalization of relations, there was kind of a status quo of national security types in the United States feeling concerned about some things that they would see from the Chinese side. My first time in China was in the summer of '95, and that was a time where there was a lot of tension over Taiwan, and the Clinton administration sent an aircraft carrier through the Taiwan Straits. And my very first summer in China, we were all worried would some kind of conflict break out while we were there. So for people with a national security remit, being concerned about rising Chinese power has been ongoing for as long as I can remember. The business community, certainly since the 1980s with reform and opening, and accelerating through the 1990s, accelerating further after China's entry into the WTO, has viewed China as a target of opportunity. And so the concerns from the national security side were balanced by this robust desire on the part of commercial actors in the U.S. context to develop ties in China and to take advantage of what was clearly an enormous market. The third group in this picture would be people like me, academics, NGOs, and I think within that group, generally speaking, there was a sense that yes, China was still an authoritarian country. Yes, China was repressive. Yes, China was doing certain things vis-a-vis, let's say, the Tibetans. Over time, vis-a-vis Falun Gong, then moving up further in time vis-a-vis rights activists that were troubling. But there was this general sense that China was on a trajectory of broad reform. And so, yes, there were things to be concerned about, there were things to criticize, but on the whole, there was a sense that, not necessarily because of anything that the Chinese Communist Party leadership was saying, but just because of the sense of history and the dynamics of globalization and China's growing more entwined in the global economy, the internet, all of those things that we used to think in the 1990s, that China was moving in a direction of reform. So those three types of perspectives came together on the US side and created sort of a static picture for as long as I've been studying China since the mid-90s through, I would say, late 2000s for sure, and into the early years of the Xi Jinping administration when Xi Jinping came into power in 2012. And what's happened to change that, starting in, these are hard dates to be very precise about, but certainly it becomes clear as we move into the early years of Xi Jinping's administration that one, the national security concerns which had always existed became more robust as China began to act in more bold ways in the South China Sea, vis-a-vis India, vis-a-vis its neighbors, vis-a-vis Taiwan. And this is coming at a time when China is itself just becoming a stronger nation. The difference between China of the 80s and the 90s to the China of the last 10 years is immense. China has become the world's second largest economy and the country that is no longer, in the words of Deng Xiaoping, trying to hide and bide its time, is now starting to come and assert itself more robustly on the global stage. China becoming more active in international organizations. So that underlying concern of the national security community only becomes more robust in the last 10 years under Xi Jinping. And Xi Jinping himself, unlike other less charismatic Chinese leaders, is someone who is very much trying to project this image of China's rise, to show China as a strong nation, realizing this long time dream. So that's on that variable. Then on the business side, I think it's probably fair to say that American businesses, foreign businesses as well, were encountering more and more difficulty within China in order to proceed with their joint ventures. There were concerns about technology transfers. There was concerns about IP theft. And so as much as the business community has been, and even to this day continues to be a force for trying to have a more conciliatory relationship with China, the business community definitely in the early parts of the last 10 years was more open to a more aggressive posture from the part of the US government towards China to protect their interests and their ability to make money in China. And then the last group that I talked about, the NGO and academic community, especially under Xi Jinping, in the time under Xi Jinping, began to feel that general idea that China was in some broad sense reforming was maybe not as, was not being as realized as we had hoped. There are many different things that one can say about the Xi Jinping administration, which has been incredibly, consequential within the Chinese context. But among the things that we can say is that the crackdown on activists, rights lawyers, independent media has been intense and durable. And this has gone along with Xi Jinping's centralization of power, the revitalization of the party. So all the people who had maybe some rough sense that the party was receding from importance in daily life in China, that there were these sproutings of independent NGOs, quasi-independent NGOs, of rights lawyers, of activists of different sorts, which had a certain kind of flowering in the mid-2000s. By the time we get a few years into Xi Jinping's administration, it becomes clear that there's retrenchment along all of those axes, and the sort of culmination of that line of concern comes when it becomes clear that Xi Jinping is not going to abide by the general practice that had emerged in the post-Mao era of the Chinese president serving only 2 terms, and that he was going to serve a 3rd term. Now, there was never, it's important to understand, of course, in the Chinese system is the party and the state, and Xi Jinping is both the General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party and is also the President of China. The more important role is General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party. That's the primary one. And for that, there is no term limit. There was never any term limit. But the presidency had a term limit, and prior to Xi Jinping, Hu Jintao served 2 terms as president and also General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party. Jiang Zemin did the same. And so that was a big deal that Xi Jinping was not going to only serve 2 terms and work to amend the Chinese constitution to serve a 3rd term. So it became a focal point at that point, around 2017, with the 19th Party Congress, that all of these concerns kind of came together. And so suddenly you had a moment, I think, that was building up to that point, but then became very clear in 2017 that the American posture towards China was going to change. What added fuel to all of this was the presidency of Donald Trump, who came in and I think in some ways had a very transactional idea about China. He came in with a very perhaps misguided but strongly held belief in a certain equation of trade deficits. And so he came in with this notion of hitting China very hard on the trade front and launched what we call the trade war with these tariffs, which are controversial in many different respects. But his style was to proceed with the sort of trade-driven agenda with rhetoric that was broader. And so you had this underlying situation of rising concern among these different US constituencies about China, which then becomes accelerated with this more heated rhetoric from the Trump administration about China, which only becomes more heated as his presidency continues, in part because of the COVID crisis. To the extent that Trump was transactional in his approach towards China before COVID, once COVID happened and he understood in his own way of thinking that COVID was going to pose, as it did, a risk to his presidency, and COVID came from China, it accelerated his rhetoric. And then in the policy community surrounding him in DC, in a bipartisan way, there was this opening now to speak more aggressively about China across many different issues. Part of that is all the things that I've said so far, which I've tried to be very systematic and relatively rational about. But part of it transcends those and has something to do with American anxiety about its role in the world, American sense of, there's this other country that's becoming more powerful, more strong. We have been stuck in the Middle East. We're spending trillions of dollars on this, what we thought was an existential threat, but actually seems to no longer be that. But maybe this is our new existential threat. That's very hard to speak about systematically, but I think no one can talk about the U.S.-China relationship, the crisis in the U.S.-China relationship, without speaking about those kinds of dynamics. And there's things that, there's very hard to say in ways that people won't find offensive, and so I'll try to choose my words carefully. But there is a policy community around the Pentagon, around the treatment of Al-Qaeda as an existential threat. There's people who are connected to that industry. And when you have that community, you have sometimes you need a new threat. So that China fits into that. And that's not to say that there aren't genuine concerns about China, but it's just to say there's many different factors that are going in this direction. Now, I've just only been speaking about the US side, which of course I know very, very well. There's a similar story could be told on the Chinese side about what are the dynamics within China that are pushing towards a more confrontational relationship with the United States and with the West. Some of that is reactive to the dynamics that I've talked about on the US side, and some of that is generated internally from within China with respect to Xi Jinping and his vision of China's rise, with respect to the military in China, which in some ways is more maybe aggressive in their posture than Xi Jinping himself. In fact, Xi Jinping probably has to keep up with them rather than find himself to be not as sort of forward-leaning as they are. And of course, there's nationalism within China, which has been rising, has always been an issue, but has been rising, in part has been rising because the state cultivates it because it's helpful for the state in terms of the state thinking about its own legitimacy and its own status within China. So, you know, the state has this very careful relationship with cultivating nationalism. It's like a hot potato, because if it gets too out of hand, it can potentially come back and hurt the state. So they try to cultivate it up to a certain point, but then keep it from getting beyond certain boundaries. But they've done that so far, and that dynamic in turn has sort of generated, you know, not only more aggressive rhetoric in the internet in China, but you know, also has reflected itself in what we now, I think, like to call wolf warrior diplomacy. This sense of Chinese diplomats using much more aggressive language, including on Twitter and social media, but also in other contexts, that again conveys a scarier picture. And so this is sort of where we were with the installation of the Biden administration. And what I think the Biden administration has been trying to do has been to continue in the vein of a new, more confrontational relationship with China, because many of them believe that that's necessary. They also understand that our politics are there now, and that the wider policy community on a bipartisan level is there now. But to try to manage it in a more rational way than the Trump administration did. And, you know, so what we've seen over the last almost year of the Biden administration have been certain things that have seemed to be continuous with what the Trump administration was doing, and certainly up to this point, tariffs has been one of those things where the tariffs have remained in place. We've seen, you know, ongoing strong statements about the situation in Hong Kong, about the situation in Xinjiang, which were both things that in the latter portions of the Trump presidency, the US was putting a lot of emphasis on. And we'll talk, I hope, in great detail about the AU-KUS deal, because of course it has big implications for Europe. But that, you know, again, is part of this drive to maintain a more confrontational, or let's say aggressive or strong or competitive, whatever word we want to use, that is conveying this new posture towards China. But at the same time, they have made various sorts of gestures which indicate some desire to lower the temperature, the rhetorical temperature around the relationship, and maybe achieving that result. You know, it's a very interesting picture, and I can't say that I fully understand it yet. We're all in the US trying to understand it. There's still people who will say the Biden people are doing just Trump light. But you see these little areas where, for example, there will be that meeting in March in Alaska where the U.S. Secretary of State, U.S. National Security Advisor on the Chinese side, State Counselor, Foreign Minister, they were like yelling at each other and like saying very aggressive things. And so we were like, okay, so it's bad, it must be bad. But then there were follow-up meetings. We just heard that there's some new working groups. And so it sort of seems like what we're seeing and what's happening are maybe different. That in fact there is, and some of the concrete things we've seen lately, you know, finally there was the deal to return Meng Wanzhou, the daughter of the CEO of Huawei, back to China, and of course then the immediate release of the two Michaels, the two Canadian citizens who were basically held as hostages once Meng Wanzhou was arrested a couple of years ago. The U.S. Trade Representative Catherine Tai recently gave a big speech in D.C. Talking about the U.S. China trade relationship, and it was a very hard thing to figure out because on the one hand, the way that the speech was briefed to policy audiences before the actual speech was that this was a tough line towards China. And there was a lot of language in her speech that was tough, that talked about the fact that China hadn't been playing by the rules of the world trading system, that China was not abiding by the phase one trade agreement that had been signed in the Trump administration, that China continued to act in an anti-competitive way by having such state subsidies of its industries that made it hard for American businesses. But she also had language in there that was like, let's talk, let's engage. And if you've been, as I have, been paying close attention to what she's said since then, she's been in Europe. She was just in Sorrentino, right? Sorrentino. Did I say that right?
Sorry, where was she?
Sorrento. Sorry, my Italian is still very rudimentary. She's giving interviews around this time, and her language has become much more of we're going to be talking to the Chinese side. There's people within the National Security Council of the Biden administration who are very hawkish in our landscape towards China, and they are the ones who build up this AUK-US deal. But then there's also John Kerry, the presidential envoy for climate, who has clearly sort of taken up an idea of being more conciliatory in sort of language towards China in the hopes of achieving some kind of cooperative relationship on the issue of climate change. And so it's a very interesting moment right now, just for thinking about US-China relations. Is the Biden administration lowering the temperature quite a bit? Is the Chinese side sort of respond to that accordingly? Are we in a new state of play where some of the competitive aspects are now fixed, but we're trying to keep it from going too far? These are all things that those of us in the US who think about this stuff are thinking about. And just two last things that I'll say about this before I start to talk about the Europe dimensions. One is Taiwan. Taiwan is potentially a big issue because it has been a useful fiction, essentially, since normalization of relations, that both sides say the same thing, which is the standard language about the one China policy, but when they retreat to their corners, have sort of different understandings of what that means. The more that the Chinese side speaks aggressively about reunification with Taiwan, the more we move away from that useful fiction of we all kind of agree on what status quo is. The more the US side correspondingly sends military advisors to Taiwan and sells equipment, the more it destabilizes there. And so, I am among those who feel fairly confident that the actual risk of conflict over Taiwan is quite low, that the cost to both sides would be immense, that what Xi Jinping said the other day about reunification is not so different from what he said 5 years ago, 10 years ago, what prior Chinese leaders have said. But it's a problem area to think about, because whatever we may say about concerns about what China has done within Xinjiang province, which is terrible, or its approach to Hong Kong, which has raised so many concerns, Taiwan is different from a foreign perspective, from an American perspective, a Western perspective. And so if that track continues to be so bumpy, it could be difficult. The second thing I want to say is that irrespective of what the Biden administration is doing, what kind of line they're trying to navigate right now, the underlying politics of being so-called tough on China, to treat China as a new kind of existential enemy, still has some currency. Just the other day, Senator Tom Cotton from Arkansas wrote a piece in the National Review in which he called to task some of the Biden administration officials. He particularly picked on Secretary of Commerce Gina Raimondo for suggesting that we should engage with China. Made certain aspersions towards commercial interests in the United States, which are trying to maintain this commercial relationship with China. Said certain things about ivory tower intellectuals who are deluded in thinking that China may still reform. That's me. He was talking, that's my tribe got listed with his, and so that way of thinking about China has continued valence in our political world and is not going away. And so whatever the Biden, there's a lot of different cooks in the Biden China policy kitchen, but whatever comes out of that, there is this looming set of other people out there who may take the relationship again to a more heated place. So that's sort of a picture of where we are with the U.S. And now I've maybe taken a little too much time, but I want to now sort of talk about where Europe seems to fit into all of this. And so just a couple of big points. First is to say that certainly under the Trump administration, we in the U.S. had our own contentious relationship with Europe, right? Trump, again, from his mindset of thinking entirely in terms of who owes me money, who is not paying, who's taking advantage of us. That's his sort of worldview. That drove a lot of the rhetoric around payments for NATO and about trade issues. The Biden people campaigned on and came into office with this sense of our big idea for what we're going to do differently, not just vis-a-vis China, but just in general, is we are going to revitalize transatlantic ties. They love this language of allies and partners, right? And that is sort of their major notion of how to proceed differently on the world stage, and also vis-a-vis China. So whatever we're doing vis-a-vis China will now be done together with allies and partners. And so there's a very strong effort to bring Europe on board with whatever we're trying to figure out to do vis-a-vis China. And so as an American who's been looking at this, and so this is where I'm going to be very curious to hear from all of you, a few things seem clear. One is that some of the things that I talked about in terms of the dynamics within the US context of the national security, commercial interests, NGO, academics, some of that has been replicated in Europe as well. And is replicated in different ways in different countries and also at the European level. And so, for example, in the past year or two, the concerns about the treatment of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang has become a focal point for some European parliamentarians and also for researchers and academicians at different institutions, including MERIX in Germany. And that has triggered a response from the Chinese side. Business, I don't know as much. I can't say as much as to whether the concerns that American businesses have had about technology transfer, IP theft, ability to break into the Chinese market, have they been felt as robustly by European businesses? I don't know, but I assume that at a broad level, whatever concerns American businesses have had, they are still lobbying now at the moment for a more smooth relation with China. And I think that European businesses on the whole probably have the same attitude, who look at China as a target of opportunity, whether it's in terms of particular national industries in Europe or Chinese visiting Europe, that seems to be shared across the Atlantic. And also there is a sense, I think, both within individual European countries and also at Europe at a general level, of not wanting to do exactly what the US is doing and sort of seeing its own spaces of opportunity. And one place where that became very clear was in the negotiations and then the signing of the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment, the CAI, that was signed just like maybe a couple weeks into or a month into the Biden administration between Europe and China. And in the US, it sort of landed as a bomb in the DC policymaking community because the Biden people were coming into power. They were telling everyone, our big thing is we're going to work with Europe on China. And before they got to even basically, I can't remember the exact timeline. Was it within, maybe they hadn't even come into power yet. It was in December. And so, Jake Sullivan was tweeting, basically, stop, wait for us to come into power. And the Chinese side was clearly, in a way, I mean, these kinds of negotiations have many years behind them. So it's not like this all came up out of nowhere. But it seemed as if they were accelerating it in part because they wanted to make a point that, look, you think you can leverage Europe against us, but we have our own independent relation with Europe. What is, of course, ironic about that is that it made the point, it landed as a bomb in the policymaking environment in DC before the Biden administration came into power, but then promptly, the whole thing maybe got blown up. We don't know yet. We don't know what's going to happen because of the sanctions that China imposed on the European parliamentarians. If you want an agreement like that to be ratified within European countries and by the European Parliament, it's not a good idea to suddenly start sanctioning European academics and NGO people. We don't know. We'll have to see what happens. What's also very interesting about the CAI is that it has provisions on forced labor in particular that are surprising in what China was willing to agree to in terms of monitoring and trying to keep supply chains clean. And in fact, some people are looking at that now and saying, this shows that actually, because China is now trying to join the CPTPP, the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, which would require China to make certain new types of commitments. And people say, look, China's already, look at what they agreed to commit to in the CAI, the CAI. They're actually close to that. So the CAI is interesting in many different respects, both in terms of what China was going to negotiate, both in terms of the message they were trying to send to the US, but then also in terms of the fact that, at least for now, it's moribund. We don't know. And part of what seemed to be the driving force behind the acceleration of negotiations were Angela Merkel and Macron. Of course, Merkel is no longer president of Germany, and Macron, we'll have to see what happens. So this is where I think, and maybe I'd like to hear from all of you as well, it seems as if this will be an interesting moment now for Europe in terms of how it thinks about the relation with China, how it thinks about what the US is trying to get Europe to do. Much of it will be driven, I think, by who becomes more at the European level, who becomes sort of the new Merkel. Will it be Scholz? Will it be Draghi? Will it be Macron? These are all things that we don't know, and each of them might have a slightly different perspective. There's already some writing. Ian Johnson from the Council on Foreign Relations just the other day wrote a piece. He's in Berlin now, and so he wrote a piece about how Scholz has or Scholz, my German is as bad as my Italian, has a window now to move away from Merkel's perhaps excessively conciliatory approach towards China and adopt a more tough or a more aggressive posture. I don't know if that's something that Scholz is interested in, but it seems at least there's a window for something like that to happen if there's a desire within Germany. Of course, what happens within Germany, what happens within Italy. Italy, of course, a couple of years ago was the first European country to sign for the Belt and Road Initiative. Draghi, as I understand it, came into power saying we're going to revisit that, but has not taken Italy out of it. Draghi is also trying to navigate. So as I understand Europe, and I'm an expert on China, I'm not an expert in Europe, but as I understand it, you have dynamics within each of these major countries. And then you also have dynamics at the European level, which are driven by what's happening in the individual countries. And all of that is in flux. China lately has been picking on Lithuania because Lithuania had the temerity to recognize Taiwan. That doesn't seem to be something that's like great strategy for China vis-a-vis Europe, because that's the kind of thing that I think probably gets read a certain way within the European community. But at the same time, I think when the US very aggressively is trying to get European individual countries and then Europe as a whole to sort of buy this notion of we're all in this together vis-a-vis China, that has some obstacles as well. And the whole, this I get to talk about AUKUS, AUKUS now, that sort of became a focal point for the European sense that it sounds nice that the Americans are saying we're all allies and partners and we're all going to do this together, but is the approach that America taking under the Biden administration in actuality all that different from the Trump administration? That whole mess of how the French were not told, of how the French reaction then triggered the EU pulling back from the trade agreement with Australia, how it crystallized this European sense that America talks a certain way, but maybe is still acting in its own interests. That I think is part of this landscape now as well. And I know that the American administration has done a lot to try to repair the hurt feelings. It has a lot of outreach, some of which was met with maybe characteristic French sarcasm, and some of which may be landing more effectively. But it shows that picture is in flux. The last thing I'll say before maybe we can have some dialogue is, what is the path forward then from a European perspective? And I have not, obviously, I don't have the competence, as I'm not a European, I am not in this world to speak to that in great precision. But the two things I suppose that I want to convey are that it is very unlikely that the more charged environment in the US vis-a-vis China will not be replicated in Europe. I think one way or another, both within individual countries and also at the EU level, some of the charged nature of our discussion in the US right now about China are going to be replicated here. They probably have already been replicated, but will continue. And that's not to say that one side is right or wrong. It's just to say, I am now coming from an environment in which the discourse about China in the US is extremely charged. And I can imagine that is already starting to happen in Europe and will happen even more. So that's point one. And then the second point is to say, the only thing that I think is genuinely important for the US policymaking world vis-a-vis China that I think would also be as important for the European policymaking world is that there are lots of, China poses lots of different challenges and opportunities. It's a very mixed picture, but whatever we want to do, it should be rooted in actual expertise about China rather than in a sense of an idealized notion or a projected notion of what China is. And certainly within the US context, a concern that I've had that I have in my own small way tried to push back on in various sorts of engagement is to say, look, we can have a lot of different perspectives about China, but at least let's know what we're talking about. Let's at least have it rooted in an actual knowledge about China rather than projections onto what China is. And to give some examples of what I mean by projections, some of the, again, I tried to speak about this very sensitively earlier, but some of the apparatus around the war on terror, about anti-Al-Qaeda, which itself had an earlier sort of Cold War vis-a-vis the Soviet Union, all of that sort of complex has shifted towards thinking about China. And some of those types of ways of thinking are, rooted in actual reality, and some of it is just driven by their own sort of nature. So that type of thing can be a concern, but also just when you say China is sort of the new competitor, a lot of people, there's incentives for a lot of people to start working on China who didn't used to work on China. And so what ends up happening is that there's a lot of analysis about China that's not actually rooted in what's going on in China. And some of those people they'll say very, frankly, they'll be like, you people who know a lot about China, you messed up the relationship. You don't know what you're doing. So it's time for us. We don't know anything. So we don't know anything about China, but we know that you've let China become powerful and strong and doing all these bad things, and it's your fault. So now we're going to take over. That kind of discourse is apparent in the US. I feel very strongly that that's silly. That anything we do vis-a-vis China has to be rooted in knowledge and expertise. And so I think that if there's any sort of recommendation I have that would be relevant in a European context is as the discourse about China in Europe becomes more charged, as it inevitably will, ideally the people participating in that discourse will know something about China. And to know something about China, that means you have people who, because of investments that institutions make, that governments make, have had pathways to really learn something about China. Of course, in the US, we have this history of area studies, which is sort of the root of like someone like me who took Chinese in college and studied Chinese law in law school. All of that is rooted for things that I didn't have anything to do with, but back in the 50s and 60s, massive investments out of the Cold War into creating centers of China studies in the US. That kind of dynamic may be one that's useful at the moment in Europe, where of course there is expertise about China, but maybe there's more room for that. And part of the problem is sometimes if this kind of funding is coming with too much of a connection to the concern about the new existential threat, it can warp it. So that is a concern. But that's secondary ultimately to the notion of knowing more about China, actually having real knowledge about it. And the last thing I'll say is, as far as how one goes about knowing something about China, and this goes to what Julio said at the very beginning, I am of the school that there's all sorts of ways, all sorts of methodologies. We can read Xi Jinping's speeches, we can read over the Communist Party documents, we can try to read the Chinese press from abroad. But I personally believe there's nothing that is as effective as foreign researchers being on the ground, doing actual in-person conversations and academic exchanges with Chinese counterparts. I think that is absolutely essential. I think we've learned so much in the US context, and I'm sure European scholars as well, in that we've been able to do this for the past 25, 30 years. And if there's any particular part of this very complex overall picture that I care deeply about and try to be somewhat aggressive in my public statements about, is that we have to maintain the pathways for that. And so that maybe makes me an engager. That at least we have enough of a relationship with China where Chinese scholars can come to our institutions, or we can go to Chinese institutions, where we can have those dialogues and actually develop a real picture of what is happening in China. Because ultimately, if we don't have that, I think making all of these other decisions about all the other ways in which China poses challenges or threats or opportunities or whatever will be a lot harder. So let me stop there, and I'd love to hear what's on all of your minds and to see if anything I said was either provocative or raised points that you're also thinking about as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for a wide-ranging bird's eye view on not just the action-reaction dynamics in U.S. China relations that are reinforced essentially a zero-sum game, but also a zoom in the internal dynamics in both the U.S. and China on the drivers of this competition, however you want to call it. And it is interesting that you conclude your remarks with this call for action, as in knowledge-driven action, because this is actually deeply felt in the European Union as well, to the extent that the new Horizon research and framework, it's the new Horizon project, and I'm sorry, I am an expert on East Asia, so I'm not very comfortable with the European Union lingo, but it's a framework program for research and innovation. Mm-hmm. It has accorded a large chunk of money, if I'm not mistaken, 10 million euros for fostering knowledge on contemporary China. Mm-hmm. And this is this actually is tightly knit to what you're saying, because there is a dependency on China knowledge, meaning contemporary China knowledge of the social, political, economic, strategic kind, that over-relies on knowledge nodes, say in the US or in the wider Anglosphere, and for good reasons. The area studies history you mentioned has been particularly strong also in the UK. And it looks like the European Union is trying to foster its own strategic autonomy, if you want, also in terms of knowledge production of contemporary China. And this is the call was made in this summer, and I think the first deadline has just expired. I have very briefly, I take advantage of my prerogatives as chair. What I'd like to know is, to what extent is a debate also at the policy level? At the academic level, I can see that engagement and the need for dialogue is still extolled from academics, but in the public sphere, in the more public sphere, to what extent do you think that we're reaching a stage in the US where it becomes certainly harder? If there is this consensus that you mentioned, at the very least in Washington, DC, is this consensus also affecting the debate and the discourse in the public sphere in the rest of the country? I mean, including by public intellectuals like yourself. And what kind of costs and what kind of impediments, if there are any, are we talking about? And this is closely linked to the second question, which is something I've been thinking about when I was doing fieldwork in the US in 2019 and 2020. Prior to the pandemic, it looks like American public opinion was not particularly into the China threat, quote unquote. I mean, maybe they understood China as a problem for the reasons you mentioned, but it was never high up in the priority of security threats. There was still like terrorism, Russia. With the pandemic, this changed a bit, also because of what you mentioned, like Trump beating the drums of COVID-19 and the quote-unquote China, Wuhan, Kung Flu virus. But to what extent do you see that this has shifted? Do you see public opinion prioritizing China? And if so, doesn't this come into friction with the fatigue that certainly resulted from the forever wars in Iraq and Afghanistan? So, oddly enough, Taiwan, advanced democracy that needs to be defended, yes. But is US public opinion willing to fight a war for a faraway island in the Pacific? Precisely because of where we come from, which is a more inward-looking United States of America. And this is also very true, for instance, of the trade agenda of Biden, right? He doesn't want to commit to CPTPP. And it would be the smart choice to do if you want to play, power politics also at the economic level with China, because CPTPP changes the rules of the game, and it's more ambitious, especially if the US rejoins. There'll be like more ambitious trade rules. So the question is public opinion going to follow through, even if China gets more attention, because there is an impetus that goes in a different direction, which seems to be more inward-looking, more insular potentially. And these are just my two fingers, so to speak. And
that's great. That's very, very helpful. And there's a lot to say. I'll try not to go on for too long. But before I say anything specific to China, one thing you said, I've had a few dialogues virtually with European interlocutors on some of these issues over the past year and a half. And a recurring question that's come up in those dialogues, which I know is not only in those dialogues, but in other dialogues comes up, is what's happening to your country? Are you moving in a more insular direction? Or are you out of that moment? I think many Europeans are very interested in that question, in general, not even specific to China, but just in general. Yes, you have a new administration which at least comes in saying that we are moving away from that more inward looking. Are they actually doing that? And even if they are in some ways, is that going to last past this next midterm elections, past the next presidential administration? And my answer to that is I have no idea. I don't know. None of us really knows. There's, you know, and this is, I think, on all of these stories of China, US, EU, so much is domestic. That takes up so much of the space. You know, I often think the corollary to this is, you know, Xi Jinping doesn't wake up in the morning thinking about the US-China relationship. Xi Jinping wakes up in the morning thinking about China and thinking about all the different ways in which it could go off the rails, right? Biden, above all right now, is thinking about this infrastructure bill. And it's not just the infrastructure bill, but the additional bill and all the ways in which the constituencies that voted for him want things that they think is necessary, the aftermath of the pandemic, you know, all of that is number one. Everything else that we've been talking about so far is secondary. And how it plays out, I just don't know. There's too many. We'll learn more with these midterm elections. You know, we'll see. You know, Trump is out there with his rallies. Will he be the next nominee? All of this is unclear. So I think, you know, if a European counterpart to Jake Sullivan were to say, we'll do this with you, but we need a rock solid commitment that. I mean, I think this is the kind of thing that comes up in their negotiations on the Iran nuclear deal. They'll be like, is this going to be rock solid 4 years from now? And I think that Jake Sullivan has to say, I don't know. I hope so, but I don't know. But then, you know, getting more into the weeds of your question, I think it's fascinating to think about the lag between popular opinion about China and this sort of elite policy opinion. For a good long time, we were seeing that there was a very clear hawkish bipartisan consensus in DC, but it was not showing up in the popular opinion polling. The Chicago Council on World Affairs or Global Affairs does a number of these types of surveys, but it started to show up. It started to show up. I think the pandemic has a lot to do with that. You know, for a long time, I would say that, you know, on the whole, the main group of people within the US in terms of popular opinions about China who had a negative were the factory workers who were losing jobs because the companies were taking and relocating their operations to China. So that was a very loud and vocal group who had, you know, genuine, I think, legitimate concerns that they could have and did sometimes project onto the American corporate leaders who were doing that, but they also projected onto China. The popular discourse about China has broadened beyond that. And some of that is because, you know, the pandemic again, and because of the way that political leaders talk about China. Some of that, you know, the scope and scale of what's happened in Xinjiang has broken through to popular opinion in a way that other things didn't. You know, so with Tibet, you had Richard Gere, you had, you know, certain type of thing. But Xinjiang, the scope and scale is so much bigger. I would, you know, oftentimes I would find that just, you know, I would encounter just ordinary people who would be talking and they hear that I was working on China, they knew about Xinjiang and they had a concern about it. And so what I would, whenever I would speak to sort of Chinese official audiences, I would say, you have to understand how much this is harming China's reputation abroad. Incidentally, there was a report in the AP a couple of days ago that suggested that there may be a return to a kind of normalcy in Xinjiang, that the barbed wire is down, that the life is coming back in. That report was met with sort of a lot of angst because I think, you know, it's hard to say. We don't know exactly. That was just one report by an excellent reporter, but there is a lot sort of now on this sort of track of, you know, it's like any kind of policy issue, it has its own momentum. And so there's a lot of momentum now on this notion that what China's done in Xinjiang is horrific, which I agree with. But to sort of get people to say, well, maybe now they're pulling back, it's going to take some more evidence for that to happen, and people are not going to very easily pull back from that. And regardless, you know, what's happened there is very sad. this is all just to say that the popular basis of being concerned about China is more than it was before. But I agree with you with your latter point, which is, well, when the rubber meets the road, so what we can certainly expect to see is that certain politicians will use China in their political rhetoric. Will say, in the same way that you use any issue, but, we saw even in the last election, just funny ways of like saying like some other candidate was like pro-CCP, which doesn't make any sense, but it just sort of shows that in this like raucous political environment, people just grab whatever they can and they say, oh, we can say you're a CCP person, that sort of becomes like a tool. We'll see more of that, but ultimately, will we see American support for a significant military involvement over Taiwan? There is good reason to wonder. But this is why, in general, I tend to not think the risk of conflict is high, because I think on the Chinese side as well, there are factors that would counsel against it. On both sides, like this, an actual armed conflict over Taiwan would be such a disaster on both sides that it seems as if that logic, whatever we see with the flights that the Chinese are sending, the military advisors we're sending, all of that stuff, I get it. But the costs are so high that it seems to, and on the US side, part of that is, I sometimes, and I don't mean this to be flippant or to be rude, but I don't think a lot of Americans even know where Taiwan is, right? So it's not like the kind of thing that is so easy to develop that kind of popular support for. So let me stop there, but it's a great question, and I think it's something to kind of keep an eye on.
Just very quickly, how possible is it to talk about engagement in the public sphere? So very briefly.
Yeah.
So we open up to the public.
Yeah, and I'll just say with that.
Do you self-censor yourself?
That's a very good question. So it's very interesting to talk about this notion of self-censorship. So for a long time, the framing for thinking about self-censorship in China, I'm sorry, that's another thing. We can talk about that. If you have a few hours, we can talk about that. But self-censorship among American scholars of China. For a long time, the main framing was, are American scholars of China not saying things publicly because they're worried about not getting a visa or like losing contact to China, blah, blah, blah. And there's two scholars, friends of mine, Rory Truex and Sheena Greidens, who wrote a piece that sort of, they talked to a lot of people, they got some experiences, they expressed, what they thought the landscape was. I did a podcast with them on the Sinica podcast with Kaiser Kuo. We talked about all of these issues. That's a certain framework. But I think I have become conscious in the US side that whatever, and I can say in more detail if you're interested, what I think of as being careful in speaking about China from the standpoint of the Chinese side, I personally have also been cognizant of sort of what the politics are on the US side. So to my way of thinking, an American who is speaking about China in the public sphere can't but help to be conscious of this larger political environment. Every person then navigates that differently vis-a-vis, both types of sets of concerns. I have, maybe I'll just indulge myself for a minute to just say that, my particular approach has been to speak what I think as clearly as I can, with sensitivity to different concerns, but without what I would consider to be a kind of a self-censorship. And I've stuck my neck out a little bit in the public discourse in the sense of both saying things very critical of China, but also saying things that are very much what you would call an engagement camp. And I'm mindful that on both sides, I get criticized, but as long as I get criticized by both sides, I feel like it's okay. So I will sometimes stick my neck out in a certain way, and the hawkish people will go after me and say blah 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 blah, and then sometimes I'll stick out my neck in the other way, and the China nationalists will say blah 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 blah. As long as both sides are doing that, I sort of feel like I'm navigating right. But the broader point is just to say there are politics that one has to be cognizant of in both contexts. There's no getting around that. And the arguments, the last thing I'll say on this is the arguments that people want to make in favor of what we might call engagement have to be careful, have to be done in a way that is not easily caricatured or easily attacked, if they want to be effective.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you very much. And sorry for taking so much time. And floor is open for questions, remarks, comments, criticism.
Praise.
Praise, of course. Offerings. Please identify yourself, and if you could turn on the mic, it would be helpful because we are also recording it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is. Thank you very much for.
You can take off your mask if you prefer.
Thank you for your presentation. It was very interesting. My name is Teona Giwashuli. I'm a policy fellow at the School of Transnational Governance. To what extent, I would like to know your opinion, to what extent this competition between the two countries would affect or would undermine the margins of cooperation in the areas of potential common interests like pandemics, climate, proliferation. Thank you.
And if I may suggest that we gather other remarks so that perhaps you have...
Maybe two at a time.
Yeah, two at a time, okay. Yeah, please.
Yes, I'm a master student of STG, and I used to work for the NDRC, National Development Reform Commission. And yeah, that's my background. And I have a quick question about the engagement. What is the meaning of the engagement? Like in China, engagement has a really bad reputation, which means the Cultural Revolution. So what is the engagement you... That's it.
Okay, so that's
a good question.
Well, both very good. I guess I press that again. So the first point is, the position of John Kerry within the administration is exactly sort of saying, we can't let the competitive dynamics get so robust that they prevent the possibility of cooperation on issues of common concern that will benefit from cooperation. The two robust examples that are often brought up are climate and health. You could proliferate even more examples in that bucket. And the only real answer I can give to your question is that that position is being advanced within the policy world in DC, within the administration, but it hits certain opposition as well. And I don't quite know how it's going to play out. It does seem as if at this particular moment, the people within the Biden administration who are trying to carve out space for areas of cooperation are making some headway. It seems like that from the outside. Before there was a meeting, the UN meeting a few weeks ago, Xi Jinping announced that China was no longer going to build coal power plants in countries under the Belt and Road Initiative. And immediately John Kerry, came out very positive about that and sort of indicating that that was the kind of thing that could come out of maintaining cooperative dynamics in the relationship. I think that's all I can really say. There is a clear constituency for that perspective in the US policymaking environment and in the administration. If there's a war over Taiwan, they lose, right? So there's things that are beyond their control. But if we have a moment of stability, where we are now, status quo, it seems as if those dynamics have some runway to go forward. So that's what I can say about that. In terms of, so I actually don't know about, you said that engagement has a bad connotation in the context of the Cultural Revolution. I don't know as much about that, but we can talk about that later. I think the broader point is there's a certain kind of US debate and maybe European debate about whether engagement with China succeeded or not. What is it good? What was the point? You know, and in the US, the caricature is often that they especially pick on the Clinton administration and speeches that Clinton gave in the 90s and the lead up to China joining the WTO, where Clinton and other officials in the Clinton administration would say things like, you know, and this is not a direct quote, but that can be caricatured now as saying, you said that if China became, you know, a full member of the world trading system, the economic dynamics unleashed and the openness to outside countries would inevitably make China reform not only economically, but politically. And we've seen none of that. You know, we've seen, you know, retrenchment on the political side, and economically, China has gone with the state-led model that is sort of anti-competitive. And so all of the ideas that you told us in that 90s period about how China was going to become more reformist, blah, 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 because of engagement is silly. And I would be very interested to know on the Chinese side whether the discussion has a certain parallel nature in talking about relations with outside world and foreigners. It would not at all surprise me if in the early years of the Xi Jinping administration, there was a type of discussion at the highest levels of the Chinese government about the risks that are posed by ties with US academics, NGO, business who are so robust in China. I think that has to have been a discussion because so many of the policies we've seen under the Xi Jinping administration put limits on that. And I could give you hours of examples, you know, even just in the last few years that I was going to China regularly, there was a time where I would arrive in Beijing and I would tell my friends in Wuhan that I was there. They say, why don't you come, will you give a talk here next week? Just like that. And then the following year, they would be like, I'm so glad you're here, but we didn't put this in the plan of foreign visitors that we submitted 6 months ago for the entire calendar year. So the best we can do is welcome you here a year from now. There's no question in my mind that all of those, that's a small example, but all of those kinds of policies, shrinking the space for foreign NGOs, the NGO law from a couple of years ago, all of those things had to have been because of the discussion at the highest levels of the Chinese system of the risks that, you know, this sort of exchange with foreigners would pose. And so my answer to the first group of people, my people on the US side, for why we should engage is precisely because the Chinese side sees that as a risk, right? You know, that's the funny thing to me, that this notion that engagement failed, the Chinese side wouldn't be doing the things they're doing now to restrict the scope of engagement if engagement was failing, right? If they weren't concerned about the dynamics that were being unleashed by all this engagement with foreign scholars, of Chinese students coming to the US, blah, 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 blah. And so what I get frustrated by is when in our debate, we don't understand that. We don't understand that on that terrain, on that soft power terrain of mutual exchange, educational learning, that's a very productive terrain for us. So that's what I'll say about that. By your laughing, I think you might agree with what I'm saying.
Yeah, absolutely. And if I may just like just a small remark, even the aggressive pushback against China, especially say in the last year of the Trump administration, oddly enough has made Xi Jinping's charisma, it has given currency to Xi Jinping's charisma, at the very least domestically. Well, for your diplomacy, I'd like to tell my students and in my writings, it's like the movie itself. It's a Chinese blockbuster. It doesn't fly abroad, but it's a blockbuster in China. It's the most popular Chinese movie ever made.
Let me jump in on this. This kind of goes to the point I was trying to make earlier about the importance of actual knowledge about China. It is absolutely the case that many intellectuals in the Chinese system, the people that like I talk to, even sort of open-minded officials, have a lot of concerns about the direction that Xi Jinping is taking the country in terms of the foreign policy, in terms of the revitalization of the party, in terms of the economic policies. But he is popular in a broader sense. There is something about the language that he uses about China's rise. Certainly, there's something about the anti-corruption campaigns that he's unleashed, which we can criticize. Obviously, as intellectuals, we can point out all the ways in which those are problematic from justice perspective, from selectivity perspective, but it lands in sort of a popular opinion. And certainly the approach to COVID, it's a very hard point for me because I strongly, personally believe that the zero COVID policy that China's adopted right now and is not moving off of, which means I can't go to China, is problematic. That the risks of China becoming even more insular and inward looking as you continue that kind of a policy and you can't have foreigners coming in anymore are very high. That said, on the whole, Chinese people look at other countries, look at the way they've dealt with the coronavirus, look at all the deaths in the US. It's very easy to look at the statistic of how many people died in the US because of COVID-19. And they see that, yes, there's a lot of restrictions on daily life in China, but most people in China are not flying off to other countries. And they see that their daily lives, have been relatively smooth. That's a basis for support. And so all of this is to say that, if policymakers in Brussels or DC or we're in Rome or Paris base any of their approach to China on the notion that there's going to be a popular revolution against Xi Jinping, that's not going to happen. And it's going to happen for lots of reasons, but including that he does have a level of support within the country. And so whatever one wants to come up with as far as an approach to China that can maybe steer Chinese behavior in ways that we are hoping for, it has to come from a sense of realism about what is the actual position of Xi Jinping, what is his popular support, what is the Chinese popular opinion that one must contend with.
Thank you. We have like 10, 15 minutes left. Would you like to take advantage? Please, if you could identify yourself and turn on the mic. Thank you.
Well, thanks for a very interesting presentation. My name is Sophie van Honacker. I'm a professor at Maastricht University in the Netherlands, and I'm here as a visiting scholar at the moment. So my question to you is about the role of Europe, with which you ended your presentation. And there has been a lot of concern in Europe and the EU about the hardening position of the US. And we have also seen that when Biden was visiting NATO last year, so that, well, Europeans had expressed the wish perhaps to soften the US position. And some say, well, maybe Europe could play a kind of, mediating role, or at least have a certain role in this relationship between the US and the EU. And so you as an American, I would like to ask you, how do you see this? Is this an illusion of the Europeans? Are we over-ambitious because in the end we are not a superpower? Or do you see a role there for the EU?
Just to clarify, a role in terms of?
Yeah, of let's say, let's say softening the US stance or counterbalancing it a little bit in the sense that it becomes less aggressive, or...
Can the EU affect US policy?
Yeah.
In general,
yeah, in
on
relationship
issues beyond just EU-US relations?
In the relationship with China.
So I see.
So it's about China. So how could the EU, because some say, in principle it's a game between the two, US and China, as two big superpowers, but the European Union, has some ambitions as well in terms of foreign policy. Of course, is a major trading actor, and
is not very happy with the way things are developing at the moment in this relationship between the US and China. And would you see a possible role there for the European Union or big member states in trying to soften perhaps the relationship?
Very interesting. Should we take it or should I?
If there is another comment or question, yes, by all means.
Yeah.
We'll take both. So we'll take both of them. Yeah.
Is that correct? Hi, I'm Simona Tollens. I'm a senior lecturer at Cardiff University. I'm also a visiting fellow here at the moment. Thank you so very much. It's also an area which I'm not working a lot on, so you fantastically sucking, presentation. I like so much the way you really also describe this evolution of the construction of national security in the US and how much importance you actually lend to that, right? So, and you kind of sketched out this kind of continuation or evolution of scripts, from a Cold War to a counterterrorism, counterinsurgency, counterterrorism, and now sort of China in the search of this existential threat. And you also highlighted this, that, there are some hawkish kind of, let's say, forces, but also that there is something, I think you said, in its own nature, that there is something kind of deep state there, some kind of structure that have invested interest in portraying things in a certain way. Right? So I'm just in terms of that shift from counterterrorism, Middle East, very much oriented perhaps somewhere in Sahel, to China. Because in these shifts, there are some losers and some winners sometimes, right? So could you just give us some examples, like, how is this shift, going smoothly for some, perhaps other for less? We can see an enhanced role of the Navy. There would be different types of infrastructure and forces and so on that would be at play. So if you could elaborate, I would be so pleased. Thank you.
And we take a final comment or question, if you don't mind.
My head is full. Let me try these.
Well, I can sum it up for you. Europe as a critical military industrial complex.
Okay. I do my best.
I'll try to be short. My name is Svetlana Lebedenko. I'm a PhD researcher at the EUI in law department. And my question is about common prosperity as a new notion in the debate. Yeah. What's your position on it? And since your background is in law, have you observed any changes in Chinese law related to common prosperity?
No more. That's a lot. Sorry. Okay, so let me try to go through all those. All very excellent. So the first question poses, I think, as I understand it, given that there's concerns within European countries and at the EU level about the sort of more hawkish or tough or confrontational stance the US is taking towards China, is there some runway, some way in which European policymakers who hold those views can affect US policy on it? And my initial instinct is to say no, both because I think that some of the European policymakers share those concerns that the US has. So I don't know if it's a consistent position within European countries or at the EU level that all the things that the US has been doing are wrong. So if it was, so that would be my first question. If we, just for the sake of argument, said, well, let's say that there was a consensus, which I don't think there is, but if there was a consensus at the EU level that the US has gone too far, or that US and China have gone too far, because I do think we can't just think that this is just the US or just China. I think there's a mix of things coming from both countries that have gotten to this point. Is there some way that that type of perspective from the European policymakers could impact, and let's broaden it, not just US, but also China? It's hard for me to see that at the surface level because so much is driven from internal policymaking dynamics and internal politics that it's hard to see how a different perspective coming from the European side could affect that. But I do think that there are things that can happen on the European side that would have an impact on the sort of either the US or China's approach to these things, including something as sort of prosaic as if European businesses start doing better in China than American businesses, right? That's not necessarily something that's being conveyed at the policy level, but that's something our US are, you know, if the CAI came back to life, and it's dead right now, the CAI agreement, but if it came back to life and all of these sort of like new sort of market opportunities for European businesses that were contemplated by the agreement in China start to be realized by European businesses, that's going to have an impact on our policymaking world. Already American businesses, you know, through the U.S. Chamber of Commerce are lobbying the Biden administration. They get criticized because in our political world right now, there is so much currency for being tough on China. You know, when the American businesses lobby the Biden administration to reduce the tariffs, they get criticized for, you know, not having the nation's best interests in mind. But if they start really losing out on opportunities to European businesses, you know, that it's gonna have an impact. Maybe somewhat more in an elevated sense on issues like climate change. I mean, we do have someone in our policy world right now, in our administration, in John Kerry, who've already, I mean, John Kerry is more in a better position to sort of advance the perspective that we need to maintain a cooperative dynamic in order to work together on something like climate change. But one could imagine if John Kerry did not have that job, if he was not in that position, that European perspectives on that issue could be expressed through various multilateral forums in ways that, you know, might have it. But it's good to have, if you think that that's right, it's good to have John Kerry in that position because that's more effective than sort of soft lobbying from European policymakers. On your question, I am totally fascinated by that. I'm not a military research guy, so I don't know that world so well, but I am very aware that you know, there's a whole apparatus that both existed before, but also grew in size and complexity and proliferated after 9/11 and in terms of the war on terror and the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And it's a world of think tanks, and it's a world of military contractors, and it's a world of, you know, defense priorities. It's a living organism. There's a lot of different pieces there. And I can see in broad terms that, you know, that organism has shifted to thinking about China, but I'm not deep enough in the world to understand all the different, I think it'd be, you know, I have very sort of sociological tendencies in my thinking. And so I think the sociology of it would be fascinating to see, like, you know, people in think tanks who 10 years ago, 5 years ago were writing about Iraq and Afghanistan are now writing about China, right? You know, military contractors who their presentations to the Pentagon officials 5-10 years ago were all about bombs for Afghanistan and Iraq, and now are for, you know, toys for some conflict in the Pacific Ocean. I don't know that stuff, but I'm sure, you know, you could do an interesting study on all of that stuff. And that's not to say, I'm not trying to say that, you know, it's all made up, right? There are actual reasons why, you know, one can say for our defense community that China is a concern now. That's a legitimate point. But it also has a life in those sort of bureaucratic or policymaking, you know, organisms that has its own momentum. And I think just as a scholar, that would be fascinating to try to understand. On the common prosperity stuff, so that's very good. So this current moment in China, which is in the lead up to the 20th Party Congress, where Xi Jinping is going to, you know, formally take on his next term. And he has, in general, ambitions for the country. We're seeing a lot of stuff that sometimes comes under this broad rubric of common prosperity. We're seeing, you know, parts of it have to do with sort of crackdown on tech companies. And now the Wall Street Journal just reported the other day that there may be some crackdown coming for financial companies in China. We're seeing it in sort of a rhetoric about socialism and socialism ideas. And it's hard to know exactly what to make of it. And it's the kind of thing that, for those of us who study Chinese regulation, it would help a lot to go in person and to talk to people and to understand, what are the bureaucratic drivers for a lot of this stuff? How much of it is really thought through at the very highest level of Xi Jinping and his, and what are their goals? At a very broad level of abstraction, it's obvious that if Xi Jinping believes, as I think he does, that the only path for China is to have the Communist Party be in strong control of the country. He believes that, whether or not we agree or not, that's something he believes. It's very hard, and so a lot of what he's trying to do is to revitalize the party institutions so that it can play that role. It is hard to kind of say to the Chinese people, communism, Communist Party, blah, 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 Mao maybe wasn't so bad, all of this stuff. And also we have the most billionaires of any country in the world. It's just hard to kind of, that's a big disconnect. And for a long time, that disconnect just kind of existed. But that was before, this Xi Jinping really pushed the pedal on the party side. And so I think there is a level at which he's trying to balance out that image. Because, China is in many ways not just a market economy, but a hypermarket economy. It's not just capitalism, but it's capitalism without any social safety net. And that's, if your whole claim for legitimacy at a rhetorical level has to do with, socialist values and all those things, that's bad. The hard question is, how far can he really take it? How far can you really transform a society that is already so marketized, that already has so much private wealth, that has a lot of interests that are, there's a level you can take down Jack Ma, you can take down, someone else that is sort of, but can you really, really genuinely get at the fundamental orientation of the Chinese economy? It's a big one. And so I think probably my guess for now is that a lot of this stuff is interesting and real, but it's not as completely transformative of the relationship of the Chinese state and the economy and society as sometimes in our reporting about it we might think it is. But it's interesting to follow. It's definitely an interesting moment, and there's a lot of interesting writing about it these days.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure, and we look forward to continue the conversation. And who knows, when you'll be back in here at UI in 2 years' time, whether you'll allow us to record it.
I can only come back in 2 years.
No, sorry. In 2 months' time.
That's good. That's good.
Whether you will allow us to record it, whether you want your views aired also on YouTube America.
Of course.
No, we'll see the evolution of this relationship, and whether Xi Jinping is confirmed in power, of course, and for whether he will still be around, and what Europe will do in this brewing competition between the U.S. and China. I think this is going to be an interesting moment in time when we will see the evolution also of our alignment or not in what goes by the name of the Indo-Pacific, because there are signals, as mentioned, that hint at a different positioning.
Strategic ambiguity.
But on the other hand, what you referred to in terms of politicization and securitization of China is more and more present in our discourses within Europe. So the jury is open, and much will also depend on what France and Germany's leaders and new leaders will decide to do. So thank you so much. It's been a pleasure, and we look forward to continue this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.